Boris Johnson has a very big day ahead of him. That's because there are two important events about to happen, and both of them involve the tarnished legacy of a former Prime Minister who's always had a pretty casual relationship to the truth, allegedly. First up is the parliamentary inquiry into Johnson's conduct. He'll be giving evidence to a cross-party privileges committee investigating whether the former Prime Minister deliberately misled MPs over parties held in Downing Street during the COVID lockdowns. That hearing is due to be broadcast live. The committee has already found that there is significant evidence that Johnson and his aides knew that the Prime Minister was in breach of the lockdown rules and that Johnson misled Parliament over the parties. Now, the committee has published his written evidence. In it, Johnson says this. It is clear from the investigation that there is no evidence at all that supports an allegation that I intentionally or recklessly misled the House. The only exception is the assertions of the discredited Dominic Cummings, which are not supported by any documentation. There is not a single document that indicates that I received any warning or advice that any event broke or may have broken the rules or guidance. In fact, the evidence before the committee demonstrates that those working at Number 10 at the time shared my honest belief that the rules and guidelines were being followed. So it looks like Johnson's strategy will be to argue not about whether Parliament was misled, but whether that's what he intended to do. And he also has a little bit more to say about Dominic Cummings, and it concerns the so-called bring your own bottle party of summer 2020. Cummings claims that he told Johnson the party would break the rules, but Johnson writes this. I do recall a conversation with Dominic Cummings on the afternoon of the event, but he did not mention the event, let alone express any concerns that the event would breach the rules or guidance. It's no secret that Dominic Cummings bears an animus towards me, having publicly stated on multiple occasions that he wanted to do everything he could to remove me from power. He cannot be treated as a credible witness. It's not clear what, if any, work the committee has done to test the credibility of what is now said by Dominic Cummings, including his animosity towards me. If the committee intends to rely on his evidence, it is essential that his evidence is properly tested by the committee, allowing me a fair opportunity to participate in that process. The drama. It's giving Real Housewives of Parliament. Johnson's dishonesty being in the headlines again led to this exchange between Tory MP Conor Burns and Jamie Driscoll, Mayor of North of Tyne.
Well, what we're seeing here is red herrings and distractions, a 500-page filibuster document. He was at the parties. We know he's at the parties. He's been fined for being at the parties. And we're seeing a lot of fancy footwork to try and divert this.
But respect, that's not the issue. The issue is what he told Parliament. That's what privilege is looking at.
We have a guy who's a serial liar, and I can say that without being sued. We have parties that were going on where people are having sex in cupboards, throwing up, breaking kids' toys, all sorts of stuff going on like that. And as far as it's concerned, is we are seeing the allies of Boris Johnson rallying around him, not perhaps as strongly as they used to do, but Conor, he doesn't love you, mate. He's gonna betray you. Just let him go. The relationship isn't there
with respect, that nothing that you have just said is material to the Privileges Committee inquiry.
There will
absolutely
be a process,
nothing that was said. That was a matter for the Grey report, the Grey inquiry.
There will be a process.
Nothing you have said is material to what
this
Privileges
is your tactic. You try to narrow
it down. What Boris told the House of Commons,
wait till he's finished.
And whether it was true or not. That is what Privileges are looking at. It's very tightly defined, and rightly so.
So there is a process, but this is also about a wider issue about a guy who was in charge, who has covered up the Owen Paterson affair, who had the Chris Pincher issue, never mind anything about gold wallpaper. And we still have people trying to defend him. And you're doing your best, you're doing a valiant job.
I think if you were on Privileges, you'd have to recuse yourself.
And I'm not, because I'm not an MP, I'm a mayor, I just create jobs. I don't get involved in the Westminster bubble. But you know what, he's not going to back you. He's not loyal to anybody.
The Privileges Committee inquiry isn't even the most important bit of Johnson's track record up for scrutiny. Rishi Sunak's Windsor framework will face its first test in Parliament. That's the deal that Sunak managed to strike with the EU and which will replace Johnson's disastrous Northern Ireland Protocol. It was part of what Johnson sold to the country as an oven-ready Brexit. Instead, it caused significant delays in the shipment of goods between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. That's because under it, customs checks take place at the Northern Ireland ports. Unionists in Northern Ireland have argued that this amounts to a hard border between it and the rest of the UK, and they've used the protocol as an excuse to refuse to enter into a power-sharing agreement with Sinn Féin at Stormont after the Republicans became the biggest party in the elections last May. Sunak's Windsor framework promised to eliminate that hard border and significantly speed up checks. But because Northern Ireland would still enjoy borderless trade with the EU, it remains subject to some EU regulations. However, the deal contains what's called the Stormont break. That allows the Northern Ireland Assembly, which creates laws in Northern Ireland, to object to new EU rules. Of course, the DUP isn't happy with this deal, and party leader Jeffrey Donaldson spoke to Sky News.
We've been assessing the Windsor framework now since it was launched. I've already outlined some of the key concerns that we have about these proposals. It was indicated by some in government that the vote on Wednesday was some sort of indicative vote of support for the Windsor framework. And based on where we are at the moment and the need for those key concerns to be addressed, we're not in a position to endorse the Windsor framework. And we've made clear that we will continue to engage with the government to have those concerns that we have outlined properly addressed. I think it's important that the UK government brings forward the legislation that will be needed to take forward any new arrangements. And we will want to see if that legislation adequately protects Northern Ireland's place within the United Kingdom. We produce some £77 billion of goods every year in Northern Ireland, and £65 billion of those goods are sold within the United Kingdom. So having clear and free access to our biggest market is fundamentally and vitally important for Northern Ireland, and we need to get this right.
Another group who've come out against the new framework are the Brexit headbangers in the European Research Group, many of whom were Johnson loyalists. They've released their own legal report into the Windsor framework. Announcing the result of that report, ERG Chairman Marc Francois began by quoting ERG Chairman Marc Francois.
Commenting on the release of the legal assessment of the Windsor framework, the ERG Chairman Marc Francois said, I'd like to thank the Star Chamber, chaired by Sybil Cash MP and ably supported by Martin Howe KC, Barnabas Reynolds and David Jones MP, for their diligent and thorough examination of the legal implications of the Windsor framework. The Star Chamber's principal findings are that EU law will still be supreme in Northern Ireland. The rights of its people under the 1800 Act of Union are not restored. The Green Lane is not really a green lane at all. The Stormont break is practically useless, and the framework itself has no exit other than through a highly complex legal process.
The report also says this. We regret that the Windsor deal does not advance the post-Brexit sovereignty of the United Kingdom. It leaves intact the basic structure of the Northern Ireland Protocol, under which foreign laws interpreted and enforced by a foreign court will continue to apply to and within Northern Ireland. The Stormont break is of very narrow application in theory and is likely to be useless in practice. Given that Labour have agreed to vote for the Windsor framework, the deal is likely to pass with or without the DUP or the ERG. Still, whenever I see Marc Francois, I just think shame really has left the building of British politics. Anyway, Michael, are we ever actually going to get out of the messes that Boris Johnson has left us with?
Difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, I suppose it's important to be clear what's going on here. So when it comes to this Privileges Committee, which is going to be tomorrow, I'm sure there'll be some sort of entertaining clips from it. It is very specifically about whether or not he misled Parliament. Now, I think to most people in the country, who cares, right? The issue was that they told us, we had to follow the rules, and then they didn't follow the rules, right? It was a very challenging, difficult, meaningful time for many people over those months and years of the pandemic, and the idea that the people who were making the rules were breaking them, like whether they knew they were breaking them or not, we don't really care. The fact was that they were doing stuff that none of us thought it was acceptable for us to be doing, right? So what matters there, we know. It's been confirmed, right? The Privileges Committee is deciding whether or not he misled Parliament, because if he did, then they can sort of give him a sanction. And ultimately, if they give him a suspension of more than 10 days, that triggers a recall petition, and therefore he might have to face a by-election in his constituency. And I think most people are assuming that if he had to face that by-election, he might not do it because, it's not a particularly safe seat. So he could lose it, and that would be humiliating. And this guy only really cares about his ego. So in a way, this Privileges Committee, even though it's very exciting for everyone in Westminster, it's more about the future of Boris Johnson's career than it is sort of any, I suppose, closure, I suppose we could say, when it comes to COVID rule breaking or sort of a truth and reconciliation about what happened. This seems quite specific to me. Obviously, I would like I would like to see this guy humiliated and out of public life, because I'm frankly very bored of him. But I think it could go either way, and it won't affect the fact that, they shat on all of us over those years of the pandemic. When it comes to this Windsor framework, I mean, this seems like one of those examples where Rishi Sunak has done the technocratic thing and said, let's sort this out. Boris Johnson was grandstanding over this. I can't be bothered to grandstand over this. Now, that's the argument which is often made to say, oh, this is Rishi Sunak, who is an incredibly, competent, pragmatic, technocratic person. He's not like Boris Johnson, where he's just going to cynically, opportunistically take an issue which cannot be resolved and sort of try and get it to the top of the news agenda because he thinks it's politically helpful. Obviously, that's what Boris Johnson was doing with Northern Ireland, because he doesn't care personally. Now, that argument falls down because Rishi Sunak was very, very happy to weaponize and create a huge political drama when it came to migration, right? So it just so happens that Northern Ireland is one issue where Rishi Sunak has decided to do the reasonably sensible thing, because he's decided that where he's going to create the sort of pointless fight, or the incredibly damaging fight, which also happens to be pointless, is when it comes to channel crossings. So, will we recover from Boris Johnson? It could take a while. I have to say, I can't wait to see the back of him, just because it's all getting a little bit repetitive, isn't it?